When we talk about Iran's military strategy, the first thing we need to understand is that it's not built on trying to win a conventional war. It's built on avoiding one. And that distinction is critical because it shapes everything, how Iran thinks, how it plans, and how it acts. Iran operates in a world where it knows it cannot match the conventional military power of its primary adversaries. Countries like the United States and Israel possess technological superiority, advanced defense systems, and significant global reach. If Iran were to engage directly in a traditional large-scale war under those conditions, it would be at a structural disadvantage. And so instead of trying to compete on the same terms, Iran changes the terms of the competition itself. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare. It's not about matching strength with strength. It's about using a different kind of strength, one that exploits gaps, vulnerabilities, and blind spots in a stronger opponent's system. In simple terms, it's about fighting smart rather than fighting big, and there's a psychological insight embedded in that choice. Asymmetry forces your opponent to operate outside their comfort zone. A conventional military is designed for certain types of conflicts, structured, predictable, and governed by clear rules of engagement. But asymmetric warfare disrupts that predictability. It introduces uncertainty. It creates situations where the stronger side cannot fully rely on its advantages because the battlefield itself has changed. That uncertainty becomes a strategic tool. Because when your adversary cannot predict your next move, they are forced to overextend. They must prepare for multiple scenarios, allocate more resources, and constantly reassess their position. Over time, that creates pressure, not just operational pressure, but psychological pressure. Iran understands this dynamic very well. Its strategy is not built around decisive battles. It's built around shaping the environment in which those battles might occur or avoiding those battles altogether. By operating through indirect means, Iran reduces the likelihood of triggering a full-scale response while still maintaining the ability to influence outcomes. There's also a philosophical dimension to this approach. Asymmetric warfare challenges our traditional understanding of power. We tend to associate power with size, with technology, with visible strength, but asymmetry shows us that power can also come from adaptability, persistence, and the ability to operate outside established norms. In that sense, Iran's strategy reflects a kind of strategic pragmatism. It recognizes limitations, but it doesn't accept them as permanent constraints. Instead, it transforms those limitations into a framework for action. That's an important lesson, not just in military terms, but in how we think about strategy more broadly. Because at its core, strategy is about aligning your means with your ends. And if your means are limited, then your strategy has to evolve accordingly. Iran has taken that principle and applied it consistently over time. Rather than trying to force a direct confrontation, it seeks to influence the broader system in which conflict takes place. But we should also be clear, asymmetric warfare is not just defensive. It is also a form of influence. It allows a state to project power without crossing certain thresholds that would trigger overwhelming retaliation. That creates a kind of strategic ambiguity. Actions can be significant, but not always attributable in a straightforward way. And that ambiguity complicates the response of adversaries. From a psychological perspective, this is incredibly important. Because if you are facing an opponent who does not engage you in a conventional way, you are forced to constantly interpret their intentions. That interpretation is never perfect. And in that gap between action and understanding, miscalculations can occur. Those miscalculations are where risk increases. Because when one side underestimates or misreads the other, the situation can escalate unintentionally. So, asymmetric warfare doesn't just change the way conflicts are fought, it changes the way they are perceived. And perception, as we've discussed, plays a critical role in decision-making. There is also an endurance aspect to this strategy. Asymmetry is not about quick victories. It's about sustained pressure over time. It's about staying engaged, staying relevant, and remaining a factor in the strategic equation. That requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to operate in a long-term framework. And that long-term perspective is something we often underestimate in geopolitics. We tend to look for immediate outcomes, but many strategies, especially asymmetric ones, are designed to unfold over years, even decades. They are cumulative. Each action may seem small in isolation, but over time, those actions add up and create significant effects. So when we look at Iran's asymmetric approach, we're really looking at a different philosophy of power. It's not about dominance in the traditional sense. It's about resilience, adaptability, and the ability to remain strategically relevant despite constraints. And that leads us to a broader realization. In a world where not all actors are equal, strategy is not about who is strongest. It's about who can adapt fastest, think differently, and turn limitations into leverage. If asymmetry is the foundation, then proxy networks are one of the most powerful expressions of it, because Iran's strategy doesn't stop at adapting its own capabilities. It extends outward, building influence through others. And this is where the strategy becomes not just military, but deeply political, social, and psychological. At its core, the use of proxy networks is about extending reach without direct exposure. Iran understands that direct confrontation with stronger adversaries comes with high risk. So instead, it operates through a network of aligned groups, militias, political movements, and regional actors that can act on its behalf, or at least in alignment with its interests. These groups exist in different countries, different environments, and different political contexts, but they share a strategic connection. What this creates is a form of distributed influence. Instead of concentrating power in one place, Iran spreads it across multiple nodes. And each node operates with a degree of autonomy, but collectively, they serve a broader strategic purpose. Like, this makes the system more flexible, more resilient, and harder to dismantle. Because even if one part of the network is weakened, the others can continue to operate. From a psychological perspective, this introduces a different kind of challenge for adversaries. And when you are facing a conventional army, you know where your opponent is. You know who to target, how to respond, and where the threat is coming from. But when you are facing a network of proxy actors, the picture becomes more complex. The lines between state and non-state actors blur, attribution becomes more difficult, and that uncertainty complicates response. And that's intentional, because one of the goals of proxy warfare is to create ambiguity. If an action can't be easily attributed, it becomes harder to respond to it in a clear and proportional way. That gives the sponsoring state a layer of protection. It allows for plausible deniability even when there is a strong suspicion of involvement. And in international relations, that difference between proof and perception can shape decisions. But this strategy is not just about hiding involvement. It's also about shaping outcomes. By supporting groups that operate in key regions, Iran can influence local dynamics without direct intervention. So these groups can affect political decisions, engage in conflict, or apply pressure in ways that align with broader strategic goals. That creates leverage that is indirect, but often very effective. And there's a deeper strategic logic behind this. By engaging through proxies, Iran can create multiple points of pressure on its adversaries. Instead of facing one front, an opponent may face several. Instead of dealing with one conflict, they may have to manage multiple interconnected situations. That spreads resources thin. It forces prioritization, and it increases the complexity of response. But we should also recognize that proxy networks are not perfectly controlled systems. These actors have their own interests, their own leadership structures, and their own motivations. That means alignment is never absolute. There is always a degree of independence and sometimes divergence. Managing that balance between influence and autonomy is one of the key challenges in maintaining a proxy network. This introduces an important philosophical tension. Influence without control is inherently unstable. You can guide, support, and align, but you cannot fully dictate. That means outcomes are not always predictable, and that unpredictability is part of the system itself. It creates both opportunity and risk. From a regional perspective, proxy networks also extend Iran's strategic depth. Instead of relying solely on its own borders, Iran can project influence across a wider geographic area. That allows it to respond to threats earlier, to engage in multiple theaters, and to create strategic buffers. In effect, it moves some of the pressure away from its core territory and into a broader regional context. But that also means that conflicts can become more interconnected. A local dispute in one country can have implications in another. Actions taken by a proxy in one region can trigger responses elsewhere. And over time, this creates a network of interactions that is complex, dynamic, and sometimes difficult to contain. There is also a long-term dimension to this strategy. Building and maintaining proxy relationships takes time. It requires investment, trust, and consistency. It's not something that can be established overnight. It evolves gradually, often over years or even decades. That long-term perspective is crucial because it allows Iran to maintain influence even as regional conditions change. At the same time, this strategy raises important questions about accountability. When a proxy acts, who is responsible? The group itself? The state that supports it? Both? This ambiguity is not just a legal or political issue, it's a strategic one, because ambiguity can delay responses, complicate negotiations, and create space for maneuvering. And that brings us to a broader realization. In modern conflict, influence is not always direct. It can be distributed, layered, and sometimes indirect in ways that are difficult to fully map. Proxy networks are a reflection of that reality. They represent a way of engaging in conflict that is less visible, but no less significant. So when we look at Iran's use of proxies, we're really looking at a strategy that blends influence, ambiguity, and persistence. It's not about dominating the battlefield directly. It's about shaping the battlefield itself across multiple fronts through multiple actors over a sustained period of time. In the end, that leads us to a simple but powerful conclusion. In a world of networks, power is not just about what you control directly. It's about how effectively you can influence the systems that operate beyond your immediate reach. If proxy networks extend influence across geography and actors, then Iran's unconventional capabilities are what give that influence real impact in the material world. Because at some point, strategy has to translate into capability. And Iran has deliberately invested in tools that are designed not to win a conventional war, but to complicate one. When we look at Iran's military toolkit, we're not looking at a traditional symmetrical force structure. Instead, we see a set of capabilities that are optimized for disruption, flexibility, and strategic pressure. Missiles, drones, naval tactics, and control over key geographic choke points, these are not just weapons. They are instruments of influence. Take ballistic and cruise missiles, for example. These systems allow Iran to project power across significant distances, so they can target infrastructure, military assets, and economic hubs. But beyond their physical impact, they carry psychological weight. Because missiles are inherently difficult to ignore, they represent a clear, direct signal of capability, and when a state demonstrates that it can reach targets beyond its borders, it changes how others calculate risk. Then there's the rise of drone warfare. Drones have transformed the cost structure of conflict. They are relatively low cost, but can be highly effective. And that asymmetry between cost and impact is exactly what makes them valuable. A relatively inexpensive system can impose significant costs on a much more powerful adversary. That creates a kind of economic imbalance in warfare. It forces stronger states to invest heavily in defense systems just to counter relatively simple attacks. And that's the key insight here. Iran is not trying to outmatch its adversaries in scale. It is trying to create disproportionate effects, small inputs that produce large disruptions. That is the essence of asymmetric capability. But perhaps one of the most important elements of Iran's strategy lies in geography, specifically its proximity to critical maritime choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage is one of the most important energy corridors in the world. A significant portion of global oil flows through it, and that gives Iran a form of strategic leverage, not because it controls the flow, but because it can influence it. Even the perception that this route could be disrupted has global implications, but it affects energy prices, market stability, and economic planning across multiple continents. And that's where the strategic power lies, not necessarily in closing the strait, but in having the capability to affect it. The option itself becomes a form of influence. From a psychological standpoint, this creates what we might call a background level of risk. It's not always active, but it is always present. And that presence shapes decisions. It influences insurance rates, shipping routes, and even diplomatic calculations. So a capability doesn't have to be used to have an effect. Sometimes the existence of the capability is enough to change behavior. There's also an important strategic lesson here about adaptation. Iran's conventional military capabilities may be limited compared to its adversaries, but its unconventional capabilities are highly tailored to the environment in which it operates. That means Iran is not trying to replicate other military models. It is building one that fits its own strategic context, and that context is critical because strategy is never developed in a vacuum. It is always shaped by constraints, geographic, economic, political, and technological. Iran has taken those constraints and used them as a foundation for innovation. That's what makes its approach so distinctive. But we should also recognize that these capabilities are not just about offense. They are also about deterrence. By demonstrating that it can impose costs, whether through missiles, drones, or maritime disruption, Iran signals that any attack on its interests will not go unanswered. That creates a form of balance, even in an asymmetrical environment. At the same time, these capabilities introduce a level of unpredictability. Because when you have systems that can operate across different domains, land, air, and sea, you increase the number of possible scenarios. That makes it harder for adversaries to plan with confidence. And uncertainty, once again, becomes a strategic asset. There is also a deeper philosophical dimension to this. Unconventional warfare challenges the idea that power is defined by size alone. It suggests that effectiveness comes not just from what you have, but from how you use it. In that sense, Iran's approach reflects a broader shift in modern conflict, from mass to precision, from scale to impact, from direct confrontation to strategic pressure. But we also need to be clear, these capabilities are part of a broader system. They are not used in isolation. They interact with proxy networks, with psychological influence, and with broader strategic objectives. Together, they form a layered approach to conflict, one that operates across multiple domains simultaneously. And that's what makes this strategy so complex to engage with. Because you're not dealing with a single threat, you're dealing with a system of threats. Each one may seem manageable on its own, but together they create a much more challenging environment. So when we think about Iran's unconventional capabilities, we're really looking at a form of strategic innovation under constraint, a way of turning limitations into leverage, a way of creating impact without relying on traditional forms of power. And that leads us to a broader insight. In modern geopolitics, the most effective capabilities are not always the most visible. They are the ones that can change behavior without being fully seen until it's already too late to ignore them. So when we bring everything together, the asymmetry, the proxy networks, and the unconventional capabilities, there is still one final layer that often defines the outcome of this strategy: endurance. Because at its core, Iran's approach is not designed for quick victories. It is designed to sustain pressure over time, to absorb shocks, and to outlast adversaries in a prolonged strategic environment. This is where the philosophy of endurance becomes central. In a world where many actors seek rapid, decisive outcomes, Iran is operating on a different timeline. It is willing to engage in long-term competition, where the goal is not necessarily to win quickly, but to remain relevant, to remain capable, and to remain engaged in the strategic equation over time. And that matters because time is one of the most important resources in any conflict. If you can extend the duration of a conflict, you change the cost structure for your opponent, you increase their financial burden, their political exposure, and their psychological strain. Over time, those pressures accumulate. And that accumulation can lead to shifts in behavior, even without a decisive military outcome. Now, from a psychological perspective, this is extremely powerful. Sustained pressure creates fatigue. It forces leaders to make repeated decisions under stress. It tests public support. It challenges economic stability, and it introduces uncertainty into long-term planning, because when a conflict doesn't resolve quickly, it becomes harder to predict where it is going, and that uncertainty affects everything from investment to diplomacy to domestic politics. Iran's strategy leverages this dynamic by avoiding the kinds of actions that would lead to rapid escalation into full-scale war. Instead, it operates in a space where pressure can be applied incrementally. Small actions repeated over time can have a cumulative effect, and that cumulative effect is often more difficult to counter than a single decisive event. But there's also a philosophical dimension here. Endurance is not just about waiting, it's about persistence with purpose. It reflects a belief that time can be an asset, not just a constraint. That by remaining engaged, by continuing to apply pressure, and by adapting to changing conditions, it is possible to gradually shift the strategic balance. This approach also introduces a different kind of risk for adversaries, because when a conflict is prolonged, the definition of success can begin to change. What once seemed like a clear objective can become more ambiguous over time. And when objectives become less clear, decision-making becomes more complex. That complexity can lead to hesitation, disagreement, and in some cases, strategic drift. At the same time, endurance requires resilience. It requires the ability to absorb setbacks, to recover from losses, and to continue operating despite external pressure. That resilience is built into the system, not just militarily, but politically and socially. It reflects a broader commitment to maintaining strategic continuity, even in the face of significant challenges. And this is where Iran's strategy becomes particularly interesting, because it combines endurance with flexibility. It is not rigid. It adapts, it adjusts to changing circumstances. It shifts tactics while maintaining its broader strategic objectives. That combination, persistence and adaptability, is what allows it to sustain pressure over long periods of time. But we should also recognize that this approach is not without cost. Endurance strategies require resources, coordination, and long-term commitment. They can place strain on domestic systems. They can create internal pressures, and they require careful management to ensure that short-term actions do not undermine long-term goals. There's also an important strategic implication here. Endurance changes the way conflicts are perceived. A prolonged conflict becomes part of the background environment. It is no longer a single event. It becomes an ongoing condition. And when that happens, the way actors respond begins to change. What once might have been seen as unacceptable can gradually become normalized. This normalization is subtle but powerful. It lowers the threshold for action. It makes certain behaviors seem less exceptional over time. And that can lead to a gradual shift in the strategic landscape, where actions that once would have triggered strong responses are now absorbed as part of the ongoing dynamic. But perhaps the most important insight is this: endurance is not just about surviving, it is about shaping the terms of engagement over time. It is about staying in the game long enough to influence how the game itself is played. And when you combine that with asymmetry, with proxy influence, and with unconventional capabilities, you begin to see a coherent strategy. A strategy that is not based on overwhelming force, but on persistence, adaptation, and the ability to operate within constraints. So, What we are really looking at is not just a military doctrine, but a long-term approach to power. An approach that recognizes that in a complex, interconnected world, conflicts are rarely resolved quickly. They evolve, they persist, and they shape the future in ways that are often difficult to predict. And that leads us to the final reflection. In a world defined by uncertainty, it is not always the strongest actor who prevails. It is the one that can endure the longest, adapt the fastest, and stay strategically present when others begin to tire.